Good evening. The leading headlines this New Year's Eve are these. Israel called for international sanctions against Libya. There were 2 failed assassination attempts in Lebanon, and the U.S. trade deficit went up again. The details of these stories are in our news summary coming up. Robin?
And after the news summary, 3 experts give us a closer look at Qaddafi's Libya, Moscow ally, home for terrorists, potential target for U.S.-Israeli retaliation. Next, a documentary report from Northern Ireland on an attempt to ease religious hatred. And finally, 3 of the nation's top economists share their predictions for the state of the economy in the new year.
Funding for the MacNeil-Lehrer NewsHour is provided by AT&T. Whether it's telephones, information systems, long-distance services, or computers, AT&T. Funding also is provided by this station and other public television stations, and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
Libya is a wicked country led by a man with blood on his hands, said the Prime Minister of Israel today. Shimon Peres called on the rest of the world to join Israel in imposing sanctions against the Libya of Colonel Muammar Qaddafi. Peres said Palestinian terrorist Abu Nidal, who was responsible for Friday's attacks at the Rome and Vienna airports, is in Libya now. In Washington, State Department spokesman Charles Redmond reinforced Israel's position on Libya.
We're ready to engage in any efforts that we can in order to fight this scourge of terrorism from wherever it may come, and that we do believe that international cooperation, greater international involvement is very useful and indeed in many cases crucial to that effort, and we're certainly prepared to cooperate in whatever way we can to reach that end, including economic and diplomatic measures, security measures, and the like.
Egypt cautioned against Israeli reprisals for the airport attacks. Egypt's foreign affairs minister said such action would halt the Middle East peace process. Robin?
Overseas, there were also these related developments. PLO leader Yasser Arafat condemned terrorist attacks on innocent civilians and said some Arab governments were pushing Palestinians into them. He didn't specifically mention last Friday's attacks at Rome and Vienna airports, but the PLO office in Egypt was quoted as saying that Syrian and Libyan intelligence services were responsible. Arafat's statement also vowed to keep up the PLO's armed struggle against Israeli occupation. In Beirut, the Islamic Jihad, or Holy War, threatened new suicide attacks against Israeli and American targets. The shadowy organization claims to hold American and other Western hostages in Lebanon. Also in Lebanon, gunmen attempted to assassinate President Amin Gemayel, but failed. 8 of his bodyguards and aides were wounded in an automobile ambush, but Gemayel wasn't in the car. The attack came hours after the latest ceasefire was agreed in a Syrian-backed effort to end the civil war. Another assassination attempt was made against the Christian commander who signed that agreement, but it also failed. In Afghanistan, Western diplomats reported that the Soviet embassy and a housing project came under rebel rocket fire as the country entered its 6th year under Soviet military occupation. The report said the rockets caused little damage in the embassy compound.
And that ends our summary of the news of this day. A discussion of Libya and what to do about it is next. Then a report from Northern Ireland on an unusual high school, and a look at the economic year ahead with Alan Greenspan, Lawrence Kudlow, and Lester Thoreau. Colonel Qaddafi is shaking in his boots this morning. That's what former Israeli Foreign Minister Abba Eban said today in Tel Aviv. He said the shaking was caused by the Reagan administration's new hard line against Libya and its role in terrorism, particularly the attacks at the Rome and Vienna airports, in which 18 people died, 120 were wounded. What can and should be done to and about Libya is where we go first tonight. State Department spokesman Charles Redmond today detailed what the United States has done already.
For our part, we had taken a number of steps concerning Libya, that we have been leading an effort for a number of years to exert economic and political pressures on countries supporting terrorism. For example, in the case of Libya, our sanctions included cutting off the sale of militarily useful aircraft, spare parts, and oil pumping equipment. So I believe there are still things that could be done if the international community is willing to come together and act.
There have also been reports the U.S., Tunisia, and Egypt, among others, would love to overthrow, assassinate, or otherwise depose Qaddafi. Robert MacNeil asked Qaddafi about that in an interview last month.
No one can make a coup against the whole people who is carrying on the authority now in Libya. It is Jamahiriya, it is the state of masses. There is no government to make a coup against it, no president to make a coup against it, no ruling party to make a coup against it. But this also these countries are not my enemy. We distinguish between the rulers, governments, and the peoples. The peoples are with me. Tunisian people, Egyptian people, Chadian people, all these people support me and support my revolution. And we are not concerned about the standards of the governments and the rulers. They will disappear in future.
Are you, would you like to help them disappear? Let's take President Mubarak. You call President Mubarak a traitor to the Arab cause for continuing the deal with the peace with Israel. What do you want to do with President Mubarak? Do you want to overthrow him?
If he is still supporting our enemy and this support will create danger for the future of our nation. We have to support the Egyptian people and incite these people to make a revolution and to form the Arab unity, and Arabs must stand in one rank against their enemies.
We take the discussion now to two American experts on Libya. Joseph CHURBA, editor of a monthly newsletter called Focus on Libya. He's a former foreign policy and defense advisor in the first Reagan administration. And Lisa Anderson, a professor of political science at Harvard University Center for Middle East Studies, who specializes in the study of Libya. Ms. Anderson, do you think Qaddafi is shaking in his boots?
Probably not. Clearly, he's concerned about the international attention, but probably as much gratified by it as worried by it.
Gratified?
Sure. Once again, he's the focus of worldwide attention, and this, in his view, focuses attention on his revolution, which is what he wants.
You agree with that, Mr. CHURBA?
No, I heartily disagree with it. I think he is very vulnerable. He recognizes that he is vulnerable internally and externally with the exiled political opposition that have been mounting operations against him. This increases his isolation not only regionally but internationally, and also shifts the premium to some kind of a Western action against him.
And you think just the United States, what the United States has done and what Israel has done the last 24 hours, he's very scared right now, right?
I think he's frightened to death of what the United States may do, because if the British or the Italians or the French or the Americans invade Libya or conduct a military strike against it, I would anticipate that this would precipitate his downfall and that a new leadership would emerge with fundamental change in Libya.
Ms. Anderson, you don't see it that way?
Well, I think from his point of view, he's seen the United States repeatedly say that they'd like to see his downfall, repeatedly call for actions against him since at least the beginning of the Reagan administration, if not earlier, and nothing has yet come of that. So it's certainly true that the possibility exists that the United States and the Europeans or other countries in the Middle East would now act, but from his point of view, many of the opponents of that regime have cried wolf before.
I want to get back to the military possibilities in a minute, but what about, Ms. Anderson, the possibilities? What possibilities still exist in the diplomatic and economic area to put pressure on Qaddafi to quit being a bad boy?
Well, first of all, the United States has exhausted many of the possibilities by having already imposed economic sanctions, already severed diplomatic relations for all intents and purposes, and so forth. They have this administration has several times tried to encourage the Europeans to follow suit. If that were now possible, then there could be a concerted action against the Libyan regime. Short of that, however, individual actions, the United States has taken most of the diplomatic and economic actions that are available to it, and the Europeans have yet to see the problem as serious.
Mr. CHURBA, do you agree that only concerted action in the diplomatic and economic area would do any good?
I think that we can precipitate his downfall with the economic weapon that we have at our disposal. To wit, I disagree with what she said. We have not applied our full measure of potential.
What can we do?
We still have trade, we have banking and oil interests in Libya. If we were to wipe these out, to eliminate them, we would then acquire the moral leverage with which to turn around and talk to the Europeans and insist that from now on they conduct their trade, if they have to trade with Qaddafi, on the basis of a cash basis only.
How
extensive? Not barter, cash
barter.
basis alone, as the Russians are demanding today and getting away with it. The Soviets are demanding cash basis only.
From Libya?
From Libya. The U.S. Europeans are dealing on a barter basis. This would increase...
Barter what for what?
For his oil, for their goods.
Mm-hmm. Well, how extensive...
This would increase and intensify the pressure, the economic pressure against his own regime.
How extensive are the U.S. financial and economic interests in Libya right now?
I think they're pretty extensive.
Like what?
There's a major oil company operating there. There are credits that are extended to nationals, Korean nationals, for a $3 billion credit. The major engineering firms in the Great Water Project are American. The credits are coming from the United States. The oil industry is still active and alive along with the banking.
Well, why doesn't all that stop?
That's a good question.
Who do we have
failed? We have failed to create the kind of environment in Libya and in that region that would allow the Libyan opposition to free their country.
Ms. Anderson, what do you think the impact of that would be if the United States did do what Mr. CHURBA suggests?
I think, first of all, I think it's worth pointing out that that's been suggested several times in the last couple of years, and one of the problems is that it runs into legal tangles in the United States in terms of what kinds of things we can restrict and so forth. Were it possible, however, to completely restrict American involvement in the Libyan economy, I think in the short run that would create certain kinds of problems for the Libyan economy and the government, but it's already become clear that there are numerous other countries that are willing to step into the breach. They did that when we withdrew most of the workers. They've done that in supplying the oil equipment that we no longer supply and so forth. So I think it would be a short-term problem possibly for the Libyan government, but in the medium term I don't think it would be too effective unless we could also get the Europeans to cooperate.
Yeah.
I just don't think you can get the Europeans to cooperate unless we demonstrate our capability and our will, which is to gain the moral leverage over the Europeans to shift from a barter basis trade to that of cash basis, which he doesn't have. His revenues have declined very sharply, his oil revenues, and his modernization plans are suffering tremendously.
So he is vulnerable, you think?
He is extremely vulnerable. He has never been more vulnerable than he is today, economically, politically, and externally.
Ms. Anderson, why does Muammar Gaddafi do what he does? Why does, if Abdul Nidal is actually in his country and he is supporting these terrorists, why does he do it?
Gaddafi is one of the few leaders in the Arab world left who adheres to a sort of absolutist position on Israel. That is to say, views the struggle, the Palestinian struggle, as one requiring the complete destruction of Israel. Therefore, he finds the more radical of the Palestinian groups more congenial, and is also interested in undermining the position of the moderates, that is, those people who are willing to talk to Israel, who are willing to discuss the resolution of the problem in terms of the occupied territories and so forth. So in that sense, Gaddafi is, on the issue of Israel, something of a throwback, and feels himself most content in supporting radical opposition to Israel and simultaneously in doing that in embarrassing the more moderate governments and the more moderate factions of, for example, the PLO.
Yeah. Mr. CHURBA, people understand, people in this part of the world at least, sometimes have trouble understanding how a man like Qaddafi or anybody could support and say it was heroic, as he did, for these people to come in with machine guns and shoot down innocent people in airports. Can you help us? Can you add anything to what Ms. Anderson has said to understand why this man feels this way?
This man is a genuine leader. He is the only Arab leader that knows what he wants and has been getting away with his activities for the past 17, 18 years. He wants to create a Muslim, Arab, African empire under his leadership. He wants to do away with the state system that divides the so-called Arab world. He wants to emerge as the dominant leader, and he has systematically used terror, subversion, and Soviet support to promote his geopolitical ambitions. He is very wise in the application of his terror and his methodology. I do not discount him. I think he's a formidable person. He is not crazy, as is depicted by the irresponsible press. He knows what he wants. He wants the radical transformation of Arab society across the board, as he has indicated in his Jamahariya philosophy. He knows what he wants.
All right, thank you. Robin?
The Libyan equation is complicated for the United States by Qaddafi's ties with Moscow. For more on that, we talked to Uri Ranan, chairman of the International Security Program at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy and co-editor of the forthcoming book on international terrorism entitled Hydra of Carnage. He joins us tonight from public station WGBH in Boston. Mr. Ranan, how close, first of all, are Libya and Moscow?
Well, you can look at it in terms of armaments, and you can look at it in terms of legal ties. The Soviet Union does not have a treaty of friendship, cooperation, and mutual assistance with Libya, unlike its relations with Syria and Iraq, where they do have such a treaty. On the other hand, Libya, like Syria, has become something of a bridgehead for very important Soviet weapon systems, way in excess of anything that the Libyans themselves could possibly use. For instance, just one example, there are almost 540 combat aircraft, Soviet-built combat aircraft in Libya. Now, the strongest, the largest of the Warsaw Pact allies, the one that has a confrontation line with NATO, Czechoslovakia, has 100 combat aircraft less than Libya. And Libya's, incidentally, include the best that there is. Flogger, FNG, Foxbat-A, you name it. Secondly, the Libyan armored force includes no less than 300 T-72, the best of the currently available Soviet tanks. The Poles only have 50 of them.
Well, why? What purpose does Qaddafi serve for the Kremlin?
Well, I believe that these are, in fact, pre-positioned weapons for eventual use, should the opportunity arise, by Soviet forces, including the Soviet Airborne, including the Soviet Marine Division, and other units that could be brought in very quick time to the area and then pick up the stuff that is already pre-positioned. Let me mention, by the way, that of the 540-odd combat planes, only about 80 or 85 are actually being flown by the Libyans. All the others are in storage, obviously awaiting different personnel to come in.
In the present political context, does Moscow support the, for instance, the Abu Nidal terrorists if, as alleged, they are operating out of Libya?
You know, I think we often draw very sharp distinctions which are not that sharp in the Middle East. For instance, one of the terrorists was reported as having said that he had also been in contact through Damascus with Abu Musa, who is an entirely different faction. It is the anti-Arafat faction within Fatah itself. And there was a time, not long ago, long after the split between Arafat and Abu Nidal, when some of Abu Nidal's people, together with Arafat's and other groups, were being trained at Simferopol in the Crimea. In 1981, there were almost 200 officers and NCOs being trained jointly, together, side by side. So I'm not so sure that the divisions are quite as sharp as we in the West like to make them. Remember, Abu Nidal was not long ago in Iraq. He then moved over from Iraq to Syria. The two countries are not friendly at all. And then from Syria he went on to Libya. My feeling is that the Soviet Union likes to have a finger in the pie. Some with Abu Nidal, some certainly with Abu Musa, because he is a friend of the Syrians, and the Syrians are still the preferred Soviet weapon in the Middle East. Some also within Fatah. For instance, Farouk Kaddoumi, who is usually considered to be the foreign minister of Mr. Arafat, has very close tie with the Soviet Union to this day.
If Libya were attacked, say by Israel or the United States, again in the current atmosphere, would the Soviet Union go to war to protect Libya?
I don't think so. I think that the fact that there is not a treaty of friendship and mutual assistance would be utilized by the Soviets not to come in directly. They would utilize surrogates. One of the surrogates, a country that does have such a treaty with Libya, is North Korea. And it's quite possible, for instance, that North Korean pilots might be introduced.
But the Soviet Union, it would not be a threat or a disincentive for American or Israeli policymakers, you think, to consider that they'd find themselves fighting the Soviet Union.
The Soviet Union would try to make the most of the long shadow, the long projection of armed strength to deter, so that they could come in afterwards and say, you see, we saved you by simply threatening. There would be threats. Whether there would be actual physical intervention, I doubt. I'm not so sure about Syria. That's a very different affair.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Mr. CHURBA, what do you think the Soviets would do if the United States, Israel, or any combination thereof took a military act against Libya?
We would have to draw a sharp distinction between an Israeli attack and an American or European attack. An Israeli attack would clearly be counterproductive. It would consolidate the internal opposition. It would convert the issue from one of terrorism to the extension of the Arab-Israel conflict into North Africa. And Qaddafi would play into his hands. But apart from that, the Israelis would lose the opportunity for the legitimate exiled political leadership, now headquartered in Egypt and in Europe,
What do you think the Soviet Union...
to succeed power and to make fundamental changes at a time when they are also at their strongest position. And I would think that an Israeli strike would forego that option, but an American or European strike would precipitate his downfall.
What do you think the Soviet Union would do in that
I think
eventuality?
they have something like 65, 70,000 personnel, East Bloc personnel in Libya, as advisors, as technicians, and as military people. I believe they would use them. You see, Qaddafi has alienated not only the middle class, the businessmen by stripping the country of its entrepreneurship. He's also alienated the clergy, the Sanusi leadership, who consider him a heretic. And he has also alienated the army, which he does not trust.
Well, you were just...
No, but to your question,
sure.
The army would be ineffective against any European or American strike. But the East European, the Bloc personnel, the Soviets and the East German security, would be very prominent in the resistance against such a strike.
Okay. Ms. Anderson, what do you think the Soviet Union... You heard what Mr. Renon said. Do you think the Soviet Union would not... in other words, if there was a strike, it would not be going to war with the Soviet Union?
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't think the Soviet Union has that kind of commitment to this regime. My interpretation of much of the military equipment, Soviet military equipment in Libya, is that it was bought with dollars, earned by petroleum, and that has been one of the attractions of the relationship from the point of view of the Soviet Union. Certainly, I don't think the Soviets have made the kind of commitment to Gaddafi or to Libya that they've made to Syria, and I don't think that they would respond to a military...
Well, all right, let me ask you this then, Ms. Anderson. Who, in terms of isolating, everybody talks about isolating this man, Qaddafi. Besides the Soviets, who are his other friends? Who would come to his side in case of a real major conflagration of some kind?
I don't think he has very many friends at this point. I think he relies on the fact that he does have, as Professor Renon pointed out, he does have the sort of deterrent effect of Soviet ties and East Bloc ties in general. He does have an extremely efficient domestic intelligence service which has prevented thus far a successful internal coup against him. And he relies on the fact that after a certain point his longevity itself suggests the continued longevity of the regime. But I don't think in much of the world, apart from isolated isolated cases of, I agree, the North Koreans and people like that, that's not a particularly strong crowd of supporters. I don't think he has a lot of friends.
Professor Renan, you agree?
Well, I would like to mention one more detail. The Daily Telegraph, it's a very responsible newspaper, on the 15th of December, only 2 weeks ago, carried a story that Soviet personnel had increased from 1,400 to 2,000, largely in connection with the installation of SAM-5 anti-aircraft batteries. However, it also went on to say that some of these additional Soviet officers were there, and I quote, to train Abu Nidal. That was 2 weeks before the recent outrage. And I have no independent confirmation, but I do think it's a very serious newspaper, and they usually take trouble verifying their sources.
Yeah.
I may say so?
Yeah.
I may say so with regard to the Soviet factor. The Russians are extremely conscious of the fact that Qaddafi's internal base is eroding very fast. There's a very strong possibility that they may make a preemptive coup against him and install someone more pliable, more suitable for their purposes, like Jalud, Major Jalud, who is Qaddafi's principal lieutenant and who has run the Soviet portfolio for the last 15 years. They may do this to preempt a coup by the junior officers.
You're saying they don't like him a lot better than we do?
They would prefer somebody whom they could depend upon and who's predictable and who does not have a charisma of his own. This is not, but I think it's very serious that it is now today a race between a Soviet preemptive coup along the lines that it took place in South Yemen and in Afghanistan before their invasion, and the legitimate exiled political leadership that is now coalescing around a former foreign minister, El-Huni, Abdel Monem El-Huni, who is now coalescing the political opposition in Egypt.
All right. Mr. CHURBA, thank you very much. Professor Renan in Boston, thank you. Ms. Anderson in New York.